Hey everybody, KC here. So I was thrilled the other day to see a press release that said my old friend Barry Clogan has just become the new CEO of a company called Retail Media Tools. And I've known Barry a long time. He used to be at Tesco, then he was at My Web Grocer, went to WinShop. I have a real soft spot in my heart for anybody who worked at My Web Grocer back in the day. They were an early supporter and sponsor on Morning Newsbeat. I always joke that, for a long time when I was just a little guy, they saw the possibilities in this. They supported me. I made a lot of mortgage payments because of my web grocer. And so, but I wanted to talk a little bit about with Barry about retail media, a little bit about what they're doing, his company that is doing that's different. But I didn't want this to be a sales pitch. I really wanted to talk about the broader canvas. He knows. I've always been a little skeptical about retail media networks and the kind of priorities that the retailers may have and some of those companies may have. And a quick note. Tom Furphy and I are going to do an innovation conversation that'll run next week, in which we're going to talk about the same subject and taking an even more expansive look about where retail media networks may be going. So I hope you enjoy this, my conversation with the new CEO of Retail Media Tools, Barry Clogan. Barry Clogan, welcome to Morning Newsbeat.
Good morning, Kevin. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. So, so you've just taken a new gig, and I've sort of already explained to the audience a little bit about your background. We've known each other a long time since the old My Web Grocer days. But talk a little bit about so the company that you're with now, Retail Media Tools. You guys say you're in the retail media infrastructure space. So explain what that means a little bit and why, after a long career in e-commerce, you're sort of shifting into retail media.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Well, I guess for me, in some ways, it feels like a natural transition or a natural segue. I spent a lot of time helping retailers build their e-commerce business and build their audience and be able to communicate with their audience through those digital channels. And it's a natural evolution for retailers to then take that audience that they've built and take that expertise and that muscle that they've built in terms of digital and now transfer it to how they monetize their first party data across those channels to offer CPGs and to go to market with those CPGs in a way that is relevant to consumers or relevant to the CPGs and attracting those consumers. So, for me, it's a natural kind of transition. And what we mean by retail media infrastructure is really providing retailers with a seamless way to, like a mission control or a central hub, to be able to manage how they present their inventory and monetize their first party data, whether that's across banner ads, sponsored product ads, across mobile, across web, across coupons or sponsored coupon placement, or in-store media as well, which I think is going to be a kind of a growing area, which we can talk about. But so that's the capability, Kevin, because I think that's the next critical skill that retailers need to learn.
Does that mean that in your new gig, it's less of sort of a turnkey operation, and actually retailers have, they have greater control. They may have to work a little harder as opposed to just turning the enterprise over to somebody else, but they're going to have more skin in the game.
Well, yes. I mean, listen, this is something I think we could get into, on kind of a bigger picture level. But this is not, opting in and taking pennies on the dollar by opting in and kind of outsourcing this capability. This is for retailers who want to have control over, how they go to market, how they monetize that data, what inventory they offer, how it kind of aligns with their overall trade plans, and how ultimately improves the consumer experience to move units, because that is, that's what we're about, right? We're about selling units and offering consumers a better proposition so that we sell more units, not just selling ad space. So very, very definitely, yes, Kevin, this is for a retailer who wants to have control and flexibility around how they go to market. Not that they kind of just want to, opt into something, take a check for pennies on the dollar, but not build the muscle they need to understand this critical capability in retail, and therefore learn the skills of it and learn how to, manage it, and understand the metrics that are important, how they sell this and how they provide that kind of closed loop reporting back to CPGs. So yeah, it's very much for somebody who I think is kind of committed to, to that next evolution.
I mean, and anybody who's been reading Morning Newsbeat knows that I've sort of been deeply cynical or skeptical about the retail media space.
Ever.
Not that I didn't think there was a role for a media offering in the but that my concern has always been that retailers would see it as and they're going to see it as oh, here's a way to create a new revenue stream, and not and see it tactically that way, as opposed to strategically reflecting their sort of their broader value proposition and reflecting the brand of the store in a way that is differentiated, as opposed to looking just like the retail media network being used by the retailer down the street.
Yeah, no, I'm well aware of your skepticism and your cynicism on it, but I mean, listen, how do I address that,
No,
right?
go ahead. I mean, take your best shot. Tell me I'm wrong. I'm okay.
Well, I can listen.
Don't be on the line with a long list of people who tell me I'm wrong. So I'm totally cool with it.
Well, no, listen. I think there's an let's just go back actually for a second to the parallels with e-commerce, right? For a second, right? So a retailer that embraced e-commerce at the time, you had to embrace e-commerce. You had to take a certain leap of faith, right? You didn't necessarily have a clear path to profit. You didn't necessarily understand how to measure or how to look at this business in a way that was not just channel specific and more, across the lifetime value of the customer. And so it was a bit of a leap of faith. And for the retailers that did that right, Kevin, as opposed to, retailers who kind of opted out of learning that capability, I would argue that they don't regret it. And similarly, from a retail media perspective, there are a number of retailers who jumped in, were early movers in that. And I think now my sense from talking to retailers is there's a number of retailers who are early movers. They may have at this point a kind of a slightly fragmented solution where they've got one provider for sponsored products, one provider for in-store, one provider for banner. So they may have a bit of a fragmented ecosystem. And they're now taking a chance to step back from that and look at this more holistically and see retail media for where it's going to evolve to, which is not just an alternative revenue stream. It is how we as retailers go to market with our CPGs to attract and engage customers. And in some ways, it's no different than getting suppliers to help fund flyers or circulars or catalogs or floor stickers. It is bringing that together in a holistic way. So I would be more, I guess I'm more positive that the retailers in particular who are early movers in e-commerce learned a lot from that experience, and now see the opportunity to do retail media in the right way. I'd also, I guess you can't ignore Walmart in this context. And the CFO recently came out and said that the improved revenue mix was improving their overall profit margin, right? And so that in itself is a great driver for doing this. But I think if I'm also interpreting some of your cynicism, we have to be careful that it's not just for revenue's sake. I mean, ultimately, this is to drive and engage with consumers in a relevant way. And I think that as long as customers or retailers maintain that North Star, then, I'm probably a bit more positive than you are on the adoption.
Well, and to deal with a different kind of media, think about store magazines, which 20 years ago, 25 years ago, everybody had a store magazine. But and with some exceptions, and the exceptions are still around, and but most of them are not. Basically, what happened is people made a deal with Meredith or Time or somebody like that, and those guys came in and did a very generic magazine, and they would talk about everything from they would maybe talk about shopping a little bit, but they'd talk about, oh, here's a place to go to. Here's 5 best places to go to Europe, and I'm thinking to myself, that's so irrelevant to the consumer experience, but and doesn't really serve the food shopper particularly well. And they didn't, but retailers did it because they got some advertising money out of it. And at the end of the day, they didn't really think about how it was augmenting and amplifying um, their core mission, which is to sell more and better food, mostly more food, not always better food, but sometimes. And see that, so that sort of colors my, the media is different. It's a lot higher tech,
Yeah.
but the impulse, I worry, um, will be exactly the same. I say this, and and retailers would have every right to be annoyed with me for saying it, but given a choice, retailers almost always will make the choice that it is the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance usually has to do with, I don't have to do anything and I'm going to get a check. And they did it with magazines, and that's feeding some of my skepticism, if you will.
Yeah. No, listen, I think, you speak from experience, and there are many use cases you can point to or examples you can point to back that up. Again, I will defend a number of them in terms of for retailers that embrace, let's say, e-commerce in a proper way, right? Meaning own it themselves and built the muscle around, understood the metrics. How do you convert customers? And we're able to really analyze that data. Those retailers, if they apply the same, logic and the same discipline around retail media, it will understand how they're impacting consumers, how they're impacting category spend, category participation, discovery of new products, the ROAS and the return on investment they're getting, or whether they're turning customers off. Because, not to be overly cliched, but the devil is in the detail, or the devil is in the data in this case, and it is those retailers that have built that capability, that I would have a confidence in will be able to embrace that and do it right. That's the key challenge.
So you sort of referred back to the early days of e-commerce. So I mean, you were at Tesco, you're my web grocer, Win Shop. So if you had to pick one lesson that you learned from those experiences that you would impart to a retailer talking to you about retail media, and it could be a lesson about doing things right or a lesson about doing things wrong, what would the lesson be?
What would the lesson be for
For
e-commerce
the
retail?
retailer. Retailer is looking and saying, and you were looking at them and you're trying to persuade them that not only should they get into retail media, but they should do it the way you'd like them to do it. Well, if you look at them and say, okay, hey, listen, I've been doing this a long time. Here's something that I observe while at Tesco, my web grocer, Win Shop, and it's either a path that you should take or the path you should avoid.
So listen, I've always been very much an advocate for, like how do customers shop? What do customers want? Like fundamentally, this is retail, and you've got to be able to go and communicate with customers, and wherever they're spending their time. And so, like, I'm just a big advocate for, you've got to ingest that capability into your business. So that sometimes is people who are not necessarily come from a grocery background, it's like digital natives. You've got to ingest that capability into your business so that you understand, and you start to understand the metrics, you understand the customer journeys, the customer flows, you understand where you can measure customers, how you can attract them, what they're engaging with, what they're not engaging with, how you can segment audiences. That's the skill set that I think ultimately, grocers who invest in and invest in that digital capability can take advantage of.
Is the technology, to what extent is the technology advancing so that a lot of this stuff can be customized or personalized? I just come back to, I don't know if you've been to the Delta terminal in Detroit, where you and I could be standing next to each other, and if we scan our boarding passes, you'll see it, and it'll say, Barry, your flight to Los Angeles is at gate 47. You've got a 10-minute walk. I'm standing right next to you. I see a message that says, Kevin, your flight to Biloxi, Mississippi is on gate 175. You've got a 25-minute walk. So, and to me, that technology is fascinating, and
Yeah.
it's the height of customization, and it's not retail media the way you're doing it, but I think it does suggest where things are going. Is the technology getting to the point where things can be that customized so that if you and I are going down the aisle and we're seeing something either on our phones or on a screen on the cart, that we could be seeing entirely different things?
Well, you'll definitely, yeah, so you absolutely, there's no question whether it's, so for example, I mean, a simple example, right? So the ability to be able to measure very accurately, where Barry, more importantly, I guess, where Barry's phone is versus where Kevin's phone is and what mod you're standing in front of or what product you're standing in front of. And therefore, in the simple example or, a more nearer term example, what ad I'm being served on a screen as an example over that mod can differ than what you're going to see. So that's, let's say, based on the kind of being able to really narrowly identify the location of my device and what against the planogram or a realogram in store. That capability, Kevin, yes, we're going to see. I think similarly then in terms of, how, this again, I don't think is, is groundbreaking necessarily, but what promotions I see in a particular aisle versus what promotions you see in a particular aisle, or what promotions I'm notified of when I walk into one store versus what you see, that is capability that, is going to be ubiquitous across a large number of retailers. There's no doubt.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, people would talk about that all the time, but I still get ads for stuff I get cat food ads, and it's like, well, no, I don't know, I don't understand why that happens. So, to what degree are retail media companies and retailers going to be able to figure out ROI on this stuff? Is there what benchmarks are going to be used? Where do you think that's headed?
So yeah, I think that this is where I think there's a challenge, because everybody talks about the fact, let's say that Walmart and Amazon and Instacart are getting 7 out of every $10 that's being spent on retail media, in the US, and I think that that's a factor of obviously access to those aggregated audiences, those large audiences, and the simplicity of doing that from a CPG perspective. But it's also a factor of the wonderful data that they're able to provide back and the insights that they're able to provide back. And again, that's what I mean by kind of, building the muscle. So for a retailer that wants to start on that journey and starts to be able to provide back to, those CPGs, the impact on category participation, the impact on category sales, the return on ad spend, or, as is very much in vogue at the moment, incremental ROAS or, incremental return on ad spend, being able to measure that and provide that closed loop reporting back to the CPGs, that is the muscle that retailers, have to commit to building, Kevin, because, that, in some ways, the challenge is, in some ways, the concern you'd have about Walmart's kind of continued advancement is that if they can really accelerate, which I believe they can, in terms of aggregating that data, normalizing that data, providing greater intelligence on that data, and actionable intelligence on that data, it's going to become, more and more attractive and harder to take back your fair share of that spend. And so that's why, you got a choice, right? Do I let them continue to accelerate ahead, or do I get on my journey and start to learn and start to, get fit in that particular space?
So fair to say that the retailer who only looks at ROI, from a retail media network in terms of dollars, as opposed to better and more actionable data that allows them to drive sales elsewhere, if they're only looking at ROI in terms of money, that's short-sighted and actually ignoring what should be the power of retail media networks.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, let's be clear, right? As retailers, we're in this to move units, and the
Right.
way to move units is to be able to offer the right customer the right product at the right time. Now, how we inform those customers, how we influence and educate those customers, across those different channels has become far more complicated. But ultimately, that is the opportunity, is to be able to do that in a holistic and, it's a bit overused, right? But do that in a seamless way where I get a consistent messaging, and that the data can be tied together, yes, to make sure that we understand what impact we're having on the consumer, not whether we brought in, $10 or $20 in retail media last week, but did we move the right units?
Yeah. Well, and listen, I mean, the thing that sort of addresses some of my skepticism, right? I mean, but to get the retailer to think that way requires the retailer to think about lifetime customer value and to think relationally about the customer as opposed to thinking transactionally about the customer. And
Yes.
that's a very hard leap for a lot of retailers to make.
Yes, no, it's not. I think that that is the challenge. That is the challenge that needs to be embraced. How and you've got to think about this in terms of, not only the skills I need to build internally in terms of how I go and I sell this, but like what am I selling? How am I putting this proposition together? Am I then able to tie the data together, whether it's, attribution across sponsored products, across banners, across email. So what is my proposition? In the first instance, being able to define that and how I can measure it. How do I go and sell that? And then how do I provide back the data to CPGs to be able to tell that story and to drive that flywheel so that we can have confidence in the next campaign and how we execute, how we can learn, and how that, like anything from a digital advertising perspective, how you can automate to improve the conversion of that during the execution of the campaign. If something's not working, how you can test and learn. That is ultimately, that's retail from an Amazon perspective. It may not be retail as a grocer who's grown up in a bricks and mortar business thinks about retail, but that is retail today. And that is the skill set that they need to learn. And so, the data, they have the data, the technology is available. I think the challenge becomes now, okay, well, how do we commit to this? How do we join arms and how do we get marketing and merchandising to come together and, understand where that race is and go to market and embrace this journey and start to learn about it properly.
You want marketing and merchandising to work together? You really have drunk the lemonade, man. The Kool-Aid. So I saw one statistic. We should wrap this up. One statistic said that this year, global retail media market is going to be over $175 billion and will actually surpass network TV advertising. So, so a couple of questions. One, is network TV, is that the main competition at the moment? I mean, if we and I think we would, most of us would concede that, retail media network is on the climb, and network television, traditional broadcast is on the decline.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Whether it's a confluence of first party data, right, and just a growing e-commerce business or growing amount of time spent online, as we know, right? The retail media is, I think it's more than a hype cycle, Kevin, right? It is a critical capability. It's around for the long term. It's how retailers are going to go to market. And so, it does look like, yes, it will expand beyond linear TV. But I think probably the next evolution is connected TV is going to be very, very large. People have seen Walmart's advancements as that in terms of their acquisition of Vizio. Amazon are obviously, have got that infrastructure and that foundation in place. So it's very, a great lock-in for customers. So you're going to see the retail media landscape evolve quite significantly.
So what? I mean, you haven't had the job very long, so nothing's probably keeping you up at night yet. But what does, I mean, is that what keeps you up at night? That the likes of Walmart and Amazon are going to be better positioned to sort of marry different disciplines together in a way traditional retailers are not, even working with a company like yours or any of the other retail media networks that are out there?
Yeah,
So
no,
they're painting on a much bigger, I mean, right? Amazon especially is painting on a much bigger palette, right? They can link stuff to Prime TV in a way that almost nobody else can.
yeah, no, I love the question because in essence, is the first instance is the biggest problem the retailers themselves, right? I mean, so we can talk about people talk about the lack of or the fragmentation in the marketplace, right? And a few years ago, I believe, Kevin, that there was an opportunity in COVID, maybe in my prior role, that there was an opportunity to kind of aggregate customers together, aggregate retailers together, build an audience that was, equivalent to Kroger, equivalent to Walmart in terms of a consortium of retailers. A rising tide would lift all boats. We could, aggregate that audience and monetize that audience. And, there was maybe a brief period of time where that might have been possible, or maybe it was my naivety and optimism. But, now I look at the market and it is fragmented. And I think that that's maybe a feature, not a bug. And that's the reality of it. But that in essence is one challenge, as in terms of what you described against the behemoths or the David versus Goliaths that you described in terms of the infrastructure and the foundation that Amazon have. In terms of what keeps me up at night, I think that as you've described, The challenge for some of those retailers are probably in a better position to be a bit more adaptable around the next evolution of probably more social commerce, right? More immersive commerce experiences. To what extent does it become a small bit more, does the point of, the point of checkout become a small bit more removed from the actual retailer and their property? Whether it's, on gaming, whether it's through, the Meta glasses or the new Google partnership around glasses, whether it's more immersive experiences. So I think that that in essence is going to continue to evolve. And that's going to take quite a bit of adaptability from retailers to make sure that they continue to remain close to that point of purchase rather than just being the point of fulfillment. That's kind of a bigger picture in terms of how it evolves. But that is one thing that I think is on my mind, and therefore our technology stack, or the technology stacks that retailers needs to be very flexible, needs to be open, needs to allow that composability, but also that flexibility for retailers to be able to access those different touch points, whether it's on their own properties, off their own properties, and allow them to to test, learn, and whether right or wrong, to make mistakes in that journey. Because Amazon and Walmart, I think, again, to kind of talk about them, but they're well able to go out there and make mistakes and shut things down. That is a bit more of a challenge for others, but I think that's the journey we're on. Nobody necessarily has the crystal ball as to how these things are going to work out, and there will be fads and hype cycles associated with some of the the newer technology that comes along. But that adaptability and flexibility is ultimately, I think, the challenge. And so I suppose take this back to our opening line. That's why I think it's important that retailers need to be committed to the journey. They need to see the bigger picture. Because if you are short-sighted about this, and it's about, if retail media becomes a die for the line, Kevin, at the end of the quarter, at the end of the financial year, as opposed to trying to influence the consumer and drive category participation and drive sales, then I think we're in a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Well, listen, I mean, I wish you the best of luck in your new job. If not that my skepticism is going to be your biggest problem, but if in fact retail media does things like furthers relationships as opposed to just building transactions, and helps establish the retailer as a resource, not just a source of product, and it's not just that one item off the shelf, then I think it's got real possibilities. It'll be a different challenge for Amazon, Walmart, and maybe Target, maybe Costco, than it will be for almost everybody else. But it'll be interesting to see 5 years from now, or even 2 or 3 years from now, how this thing is developed. Because I suspect, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, I mean, this does seem to have momentum at the moment, and
very definitely
it could find a lot of runway, right, and really move quickly in the right direction, or it could all run into a wall. I mean, these are those are usually, or I'll stretch the metaphor. So it could find some runway and really really take off. It could run into a wall, or it could just go around in circles and generate some money, but not really change the industry. And I think retailers, and quite frankly, companies like yours, there are choices to be made. And which metaphor ends up being the one that plays out is still a big question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it is a capability. It's how retailers are going to go to market. It's how they should partner with their CPGs to engage customers and drive sales. And if it's embraced in that manner, you're looking at something that has a lot of tailwind. I think that again, I hate to quote Walmart all the time, but in terms of the improved revenue mix, as they described it, from a highly profitable revenue line of retail media, if they're seeing the impact on that on their overall margins, that is something that just can't be ignored.
Barry, thanks so much. I look forward to catching up with you again down the road.
Excellent, Kevin. Thank you.
Take care.